Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera, salam keluarga Malaysia. Tuan Yang Terutama, Tuan Michalis Rojas, Duta Delegasi Kesatuan Eropah ke Malaysia. Terima kasih. Saudara Syaril Hamdan, Pengarah Bahagian Ekonomi, Jabat Perdana Menteri, yang juga pengasas The Centre, Saudara Dr. Khairy Ahmad, Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif The Centre, seterusnya tuan-tuan puan-puan yang saya hormati sekalian. Pertamanya saya merakamkan terima kasih kepada semua yang hadir pada hari ini. Satu majlis yang sangat penting dalam perbincangan isu yang agak sensitif, tetapi isu yang sangat dekat dengan hati saya dan juga dengan hati Kementerian Kesihatan Malaysia. Masalah penyalahgunaan dadah ini bukanlah sesuatu yang baru. Pada tahun 1983, dadah diisytiharkan sebagai musuh nombor satu negara kita. Dan semenjak itu, dadah ini ditangani melalui sistem kehakiman sebagai satu jenayah dan banyak tumpuan diberi kepada punishment, menghukum. Tetapi kita tahu melalui bukti saintifik, melalui amalan daripada negara lain, pendekatan yang semata-mata menghukum itu bukanlah pendekatan yang terbaik untuk kita menangani masalah dadah dan penyalahgunaan dadah. Kita juga mestilah melihat melalui kanta pemulihan dan juga kesihatan awam. That's where the Ministry of Health comes in. Bukan hanya dari sudut kesihatan awam, tetapi juga dari sudut masyarakat, persepsi masyarakat dan sokongan masyarakat terhadap mereka yang terlibat dalam penyalahgunaan dadah ataupun mereka yang ada ketagihan terhadap dadah-dadah tertentu. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank Michalis for not just gracing us with his presence this morning, but also for the important support that the EU delegation has given this study. When the good people at the centre, just a bit of background, Syaril and I set up the centre shortly after the last general election. We thought that there should be a space for another think tank in Malaysia, but a think tank which was dedicated towards practical, pragmatic, and what we call sensible ideas. Of course, every think tank thinks that. Although all of you know Syaril and my political leanings, we have practiced a very extremely hands-off approach to the centre. Khairy is nodding in the front. We don't tell them what to research. We certainly don't nudge them in a particular way in terms of the findings. And I only texted Javan last night about, because she, out of courtesy, gave me an early copy of the findings just to clarify one or two things. We feel that that's important because, of course, politicians become patrons and sponsor think tanks, but sometimes they do that for personal purposes, for ideological reasons also. We're not saying that there's not an ideological reason here. We believe in a more expanded centrist space, but certainly not for political purposes. We feel that the evidence should stand on its own. What I do ask Khairy sometimes is that if you are about to launch a very sensitive study, just run it by me first. Not for permission, but just say, hey, KJ, we're going to do a study on perceptions on drugs. Is that okay? Or not? We're just going to do it. Not, is that okay? So I can brace myself for what's to come. But I thought that this was an extremely important study because, as Mikhail said just now, the substance of the findings will inform policymakers on which direction we go in terms of how we deal with drugs and drug-related offenses in the future. There is a huge problem statement here beyond the obvious fact that, of course, drugs, when it's misused, is a bad thing. As Minister of Health, that is something that is categorical. And that is that the punitive approach towards drug offenses in Malaysia has led to, one, disproportionate incarceration of drug offenders. Drug offenders make up the biggest number of inmates in our prisons. And our prisons are overcrowded. The amount that we spend on prisons increases because of the number that's being incarcerated. A large part of drug offenders who are incarcerated are those with minor drug offenses. And that's what this study forces us to rethink. Should these people deserve custodial sentences? Or should we move towards something else? To make sure that our prisons are decanted. To make sure that the punishment fits proportionately to the offense, given what we know of drugs, given what we know of some of the social determinants of the offenses, and given what we know of addiction now. So this study is very important in policymakers like myself trying to assess how we reform our drug laws. I think we have made a good start. As you all know, we have announced that we are going to amend the mandatory death penalty, and that includes for the Dangerous Drugs Act. It was amended before. However, that amendment was faulty because the discretion that was given to judges was extremely narrow and limited. So we're going to fix that so that judges have better discretion. And I think societal change is starting to happen. It's starting to happen when people look at the cases in more granularity. And that's what Javan is going to touch on later on. It's not a binary thing. Drugs, guilty or not guilty. You have to look much, much deeper than that. There are so many circumstances in drug offenses that deserve mitigation, that deserves different forms of punishment or consequences. So I think the study today will inform us that the ground has shifted. But the ground has not shifted enough. And that's what we need to work on, which is advocacy. If you look at some of the comments when I posted on Twitter about our decision to abolish the mandatory death penalty, some of it was just batshit crazy, excuse my French. I mean, first of all, some Malaysians could not distinguish between mandatory death penalty and death penalty. Some of them would not even consider the granularity of a drug kingpin and an innocent mule who's been forced or, because of lack of other choice, to carry drugs. So these are things which we have to advocate so that people think differently about drug offenses. We also have to, and later will be touched on in the findings of the survey, later you'll see that there is a change in the perception of society towards people who've used drugs. But it's not enough. As somebody representing the Ministry for Public Health, we need to do more to tell people that drug addiction, people who use drugs. It's also a public health issue. The fact that we are quick to judge people who have used drugs, we are quick to punish people who use drugs, I think belies the seriousness of drugs as a public health issue. And this is something that I have to be responsible for in educating people that drug addiction is a public health issue. Let's focus more on rehabilitation. Let's focus more on treatment, but let's also focus more on prevention, making sure that people don't take it in the first place, especially the hard and dangerous stuff. Now, of course, there's also a lot of interest, and I think many of you have come this morning not just to listen to the center's findings, but to listen to the Minister of Health, to see whether or not there's any changes in legalizing certain drugs. There's been a lot of talk about legalizing marijuana, for instance, in Malaysia. As I've explained before, the Ministry of Health is committed towards evidence and science. So what that means, in other words, is that if the science is showing us in a particular direction, then of course we cannot avoid it. And of course, to some of you, that's the Minister of Health fluffing the answer. But what it is that, I'll tell you this, I will announce soon the framework for which we will be registering certain CBD products by next year. The science, to me, I mean, I'm convinced about the science. Of course, I'm working internally to make sure that everyone in the Ministry of Health is behind this, because I can't be an outlier in this. I have to get institutional backing. But how we get towards registering some of these products will be very important. As with any substance with psychoactive substance, we have to be very careful about how we proceed. I'm convinced about the evidence for CBD. I don't think at this moment we will be allowing it for self-medicating purposes. I still feel that we should start with it being prescribed. That will require some education, some training of medical officers so that they know in what circumstances they can prescribe CBD. And then from there, we move on. It has to be stepwise, and we have to be calibrated in how we do this. But I think we are ready, and I think the debate has been useful. But again, looking at it in granular terms is very important as a regulator of pharmaceutical products in Malaysia. So I think next year is a good target. I think we will release the framework sometime this year. We will invite people to submit proposals for products that they wish to register, how they wish to go about doing it, the education that will be needed for the medical industry to prescribe it, and for what purpose or use CBD can be applied. So that, again, fits in later, you'll see, with some of the shifting attitudes in the public's perception towards drugs in Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to speak much further because I think we're all here to really hear about what Malaysians really think about drugs. What you will see later is that it is not so simple. It's not so cut and dry. But what I would like to say is that people are more textured in their views on drugs. It's no longer hukum, but it is much, much more balanced. And I think for policymakers, and we certainly will share this with other members of Cabinet, Ministry of Home Affairs, Law Minister, so that we get a better idea of what public expectations are in terms of drugs and drug-related offenses. I just wanted to end by picking up on one thing that I noticed in the study, and that was the prevalence of societal stigma towards former drug offenders. And I touched on that just now. The study found that while many Malaysians seemed empathetic about issues related to drug addiction, they are less receptive to the idea of having former drug offenders living among them. We asked this tough question presumably because we wanted to find out what opinions were in the public domain and in the private domain. This is what I think in public, but I really don't want you near me in private. That's what it is. And that reveals certain biases about how you really feel about drug offenders. I think that's why we need to move a little bit away from punitive measures. Punitive measures should still be there, but we need to increase the rehabilitative strategies in dealing with drug offenses, and societal stigma poses a challenge that needs to be addressed. If we don't address this, research has shown that for as long as the stigma remains, then it is more likely that drug offenders cannot reintegrate back into society. Recidivism increases because, hey, you're not welcome. So when you're not welcome, you go back to doing what you used to do. So I think there's a huge role for us to follow up from this study in terms of, as I said earlier, advocacy, working together with the community in sharing the new outlook towards drugs and drug offenders. There is also indication of openness to the use of certain controlled drugs, and I've touched on that in my remarks about CBD for now, and I hope that that debate will be done in a rational manner. And I know that the headlines from today will be CBD by next year. So let's see how the chips may fall after this. Trial balloon today. Cheryl, I didn't tell PM, you can tell PM after this. KJ just announced legalizing cannabis, cannabis oil. Anyway, once again, on behalf of the center, I'd like to thank Khairy, but specifically, I think she deserves a round of applause. Javan, congratulations. She's been with us from the start, and she's really put her head down and delivered a fantastic report, which you'll see in a few minutes. Thank you, Michalis, for the EU's support in this project. Please feel free to continue to throw money at the center. We're happy to receive more money. Thank you, everyone. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much indeed, Yang Berhormat Tuan Khairy Jamaluddin, for that highly elucidating, astute, and very hopeful address.